The Cavalry at Chancellorsville, May 1865. Read by Captain W. L. Heermance, U.S. Volunteer, April 3, 1895. At a dinner of the Sons of the Revolution, there met James E. Tucker, who in 1863 was color bearer of the 2nd Virginia Cavalry, a regiment in Fitzhugh Lee's brigade, and the late Colonel Floyd Clarkson, who had been a major in the 6th New York Cavalry. On the 30th of April 1863, the latter regiment was surrounded by General L. Lee's brigade. But though outnumbered by a force treble his own, the gallant Lieutenant Colonel McVicker, who was in command of the 6th New York, ordered a charge with sabers, and the great number of those with him reached the main army at Chancellorsville, leaving only dead and wounded behind. Among the former, the brave McVicker, who had his life been spared, would have made his record high among the dashing leaders of the Union Cavalry. Colonel Clarkson was not with the regiment at the time. Mr. Tucker, whose horse was shot under him in the engagement, was anxious to meet those who had participated in it, and Colonel Clarkson invited those who could be reached to meet Mr. Tucker at his house, to talk over this and other engagements in which these two regiments had met each other, for the Old Six was well known to all the Confederate cavalry serving Virginia, each having the respect for the other that brave men feel towards those they meet in battle, where true manhood is shown. It so happened that a short time before this, the writer was told that, living in the same suburb of New York, with him was a Confederate officer, who had been in this engagement with the 6th New York, and received a saber cut that nearly severed his nose from his face, and thought that his fellow townsman had been the offending party. And on my meeting Captain Benjamin F. Medina of the 5th Virginia Cavalry, it proved to be so. How strange it seemed that after a lapse of more than 27 years, he should tell me in my own home how in that wild charge in the woods of Virginia at night, the officer that gave him that right cut was shot by Captain Reuben Boston of his regiment, almost at the same moment, and how Captain Boston was killed at the last fight of the war near Appomattox. As he told his story, it seemed there could be no mistake in his conclusion, for as I was engaged with one of my right, before I could turn my horse to give the left cut to one who had a pistol that I could feel pressed against me, he fired the ball going through my left arm and making a wound in my stomach. At the same time, a blow in the head knocked me from my horse, and I was left behind to be taken to Libby Prison. Captain Medina participated with us in the reunion of the Blue and Gray, and the reminiscences awakened then have prompted me to write all of this and other work done by the cavalry at Chancellorsville. However, before leaving the subject of this little gathering, where so much good feeling was shown by those who had often met in deadly strife, let me mention how we called to mind that as General Lee stopped at the little log house where we were the next morning, and learning that the body of the gallant leader of the little band, which had driven back his whole brigade, lay unburied on the field of battle, he had it brought in, a coffin made from the material that could be had, and buried it there, once we afterward had it removed to its final resting place in Rochester, New York. Such kindly feelings existed within the loyalty expressed for the Union by those who had once fought against it, they'd all feel that such sectional animosity would not have continued long had the men who did the fighting had the readjustment of affairs when the South laid down her arms. A newspaper correspondent, once being asked why so little mention was made of the work done by the cavalry in our Civil War, tersely replied that they were generally so far to the front and so near the enemy that it was rather dangerous and unpleasant to be with them. And this was the case at Chancellorsville. The reports of that engagement written since the war gave little attention to the work done by the cavalry at that time. General Hooker, who was then commanding the Army of the Potomac, says the cavalry under General Pleasonton saved the army from annihilation. Upon entering the Chancellorsville campaign, General Hooker detached the cavalry, with the exception of the brigade commanded by General Pleasonton, and sent them under command of General Stoneman to make a raid on the enemy's line of communication. This command accomplished nothing. There were left with Pleasanton the 6th New York, 8th, and 17th Pennsylvania regiments of cavalry, with Pennington's regular and Martin's volunteer batteries. As Stoneman's column moved out leaving us behind, we felt how unjust had been the detail that kept us from sharing in what all thought would bring so much glory to those who should ride with them. But the work done by our little brigade was the commencement of what gave our cavalry the name, which has been unequaled by that of the cavalry of any other country. In the advance to Chancellorsville, I will follow only that part of my regiment that led the advance of the 12th Corps under General Slocum, which was the right wing of the army, the 8th Pennsylvania leading the advance of General Meade's column, and the 17th Pennsylvania doing the same duty for General Howard, the remainder of the 6th New York being assigned to the divisions, but joining the cavalry command before the battle was over. On Wednesday morning, about 200 of the 6th New York, under command of Lieutenant Colonel McVicker, were ordered to report to General Slocum. We crossed the Rappahannock River at Kelly's Ford and soon were engaged with the North Carolina Cavalry Regiment, driving them and taking some prisoners, among them a captain, whose lieutenant commanded the guard that a few days later escorted me to Richmond. The lieutenant remarked when he found out that it was the same command that had captured his captain, that the captain was in the habit of being taken without much trouble. We skirmished all that day with cavalry in our front, reaching Germania Ford on the Rapidan late in the afternoon, a heavy force and rifle pits on the other side preventing our crossing. We took possession of an old mill on the banks of the river, exchanging shots with them until the infantry came up, and a battery put in position shelled the rifle pits while the infantry crossed and captured all the defenders of the works. Crossing the ford, we again took the advance, capturing some prisoners and baggage of the famous Black Horse Cavalry. We reached the Chancellorsville house Thursday afternoon, having been engaged more or less at the time since we started, with a loss of 3 men killed, 1 officer, and 5 men wounded. Having reported our arrival to General Slocum, who was about 3 miles back, orders were received from him to go to Spotsylvania Courthouse. Colonel McVicker knew full well from prisoners captured that the force we had skirmished with since crossing Kelly's Ford was vastly superior to ours, and that our advance so far from support would be attended with great risk. But as he told the officers with him what we were expected to do, he ordered the bugle to sound forward. His not to make reply, his not to reason why, his but to do and die. As we marched on, a few of the enemy were seen, but they fell back as we advanced. About dark, after marching through the woods, we reached a small clearing. The order to halt and dismount was given. A mounted guard was thrown out to the rear, and Captain Bell, with a few men, was sent towards the courthouse. The men had been on almost continuous duty for 48 hours, and as they rested holding their horses' bridles, most of them were lying asleep by the roadside. Captain Bell soon returned, and reported that there was a heavy force at the courthouse. About the same time, the rearguard was fired upon and driven in. The command sprang to their feet, and mounting, very soon formed in line in the open field. It was now very dark, and there was some fear that some of our troops had come up, and by mistake had fired upon the rearguard. Colonel McVicker sent Captain Goller back to ascertain the true state of affairs. Going back to the junction of the roads to Todd's Tavern and the Chancellorsville house, he was challenged, and on answering the 6th New York Cavalry was fired upon and driven back to the main body. Sergeant Carroll was killed by the volley. As the enemy came down the road, which was only wide enough for a column of 4s, our men formed in line, fired upon them, and checked their farther advance. Then Colonel McVicker ordered the command to draw a saber, break by 4s to the right, and cut our way through. As our bugle sounded the charge, it was at the same moment sounded by the 5th Virginia, and the notes rang out clear and full in defiance of each other. As we rode down to where they waited for us, in the darkness it seemed as though a sheet of fire belched forth from their carbines, and at this first fire the brave McVicker fell, and the rest of the command were mixed up with the Confederates as we rode through them. Besides Colonel McVicker, who was killed, 3 officers were wounded, and about 20 men killed and wounded. These were left behind, and the survivors drove the enemy until the crossroads were reached, where the Confederates took the one to Todd's Tavern, and our men went on to their own lines at Chancellorsville. The wounded were taken to a house near where they fell, and after a few days were sent to Libby Prison. I copy extracts from an article written for Blackwood's magazine, published in 1866 at Edinburgh by Major Heroes von Borsch, who was chief of staff to General Jeb Stuart. At the time of the engagement, he received a bullet through his hat and had his horse shot through the head as he rode through the enemy's ranks. The extract commences at the time of Captain Goller being challenged. General Stuart dispatched Captain White of our staff to Fitzhugh Lee with orders to send on one of his regiments as soon as possible, and to follow slowly the rest of his brigade. General Stuart and his staff were trotting along at the head of the column, when at the moment of emerging out of the dark forest we suddenly discovered in the open field before us, and at a distance of not more than 160 yards, a line of hostile cavalry, who received us with a severe fire, which concentrated on the narrow road. Fully conscious of our critical position, Stuart drew his sword and with his clear ringing voice gave the order to attack, taking the lead himself. For once our horsemen refused to follow their gallant commander. They wavered under the thick storm of bullets. Soon all discipline ceased, and in a few minutes the greater part of this splendid regiment, which had distinguished itself in so many battlefields, broke to the rear in utter confusion. At this moment the enemy's bugle sounded the charge, and a few seconds after we fronted the shock of the attack, which broke upon us like a thundercloud, and bore our little band along with this vehement rush, as if driven by a mighty wave, sweeping us along with it in the darkness of the forest. During the night and the next day, the scattered remnants of the regiment were brought together and reformed within our lines. On Saturday afternoon, General Sickles, occupying a position near the right of the line, seeing Stonewall Jackson's flank movement, thought the Confederate army was about to retreat, and called for the cavalry to help in their pursuit. What was left of the old 6 was deployed as skirmishers. When the heavy fighting gave the first indication that Howard's 11th Corps was being attacked, an aide-de-camp from his galloped up to General Pleasanton and asked for cavalry to check the enemy's advance until he could reform his lines. Major Keenan, commanding the 8th Pennsylvania, was sent with his regiment to charge the head of the advancing column while General Pleasanton put his batteries in position, face to the rear and double-shotted with canister, awaiting the appearance of the enemy. The 17th Pennsylvania and 6th New York were engaged in trying to arrest the wild flight of the demoralized 11th Corps, who in the greatest confusion were running over the batteries already in position, while more artillery was stopped and with the help of the cavalry given the field for action. General Sickles, seeing the danger, told General Pleasanton to hold his ground at all hazard until he could put his 3rd Corps in position to hold the ground, which was the key to the position of the whole Union Army, for with Stonewall Jackson in possession of this elevation, he would not only be able to throw his shells into the headquarters of Chancellorsville House, but from the rear pour an enfilading fire upon the entire army. While this was going on, the 8th Pennsylvania, with Keenan riding at their head, charged on the advancing corps of Stonewall Jackson. Brave Keenan fell, saber in hand, and scores of gallant troopers with him, but the advance was checked until Pleasanton and Sickles had completed the formation that was to turn back that advancing host, which without this check would have continued on and swept all before them and driven our army back to the Rapidan. By the shrouded gleam of the western skies, brave Keenan looked into Pleasanton's eyes, for an instant clear and cool and still. Then with a smile he said, "I will." Cavalry charged, not a man of them shrank. Their sharp full cheer from rank on rank rose joyously with a willing breath, rose like a greeting hail to death. And lo, in their midst rose Keenan, tall in the gloom, like a martyr awaiting his fall, while the circled stroke of his saber swung round his head like a halo there luminous hung. They raise no cheer. They have seized, but their glory shall never cease, nor their light be quenched in the light of peace. The rush of their charge is resounding still that saved the army at Chancellorsville. As the enemy advanced, General Pleasanton gave the order to fire, and those 22 guns carried death and destruction into the enemy's ranks. 3 times they charged, but they could not stand the hailstorm of shot, and fell back, leaving their dead and wounded. General Sickles' line was formed, and the army saved. From this time, the cavalry played an important part in all movements of the Army of the Potomac. A few weeks later, that tournament, with all of Stuart's cavalry in about Brandy Station, followed by the cavalry engagement at Gettysburg, established its reputation, which later, under the leadership of General Sheridan, became known the world over. The following general order was issued after Chancellorsville. General Order No. 27, Army of the Potomac, May 10, 1863. The general commanding takes this occasion to commend the conduct of the 2nd Brigade and Martin's 6th Independent New York Battery in the late engagement near Chancellorsville. The distinguished gallantry of the 8th Pennsylvania Regiment in charging the head of the enemy's column advancing on the 11th Corps on the evening of the 2nd. The heroism of the 6th New York Regiment in cutting its way back to our own lines through treble its force of the enemy's cavalry on the first instance, and the coolness displayed by the 17th Pennsylvania Regiment in rallying fugitives and supporting the batteries, including Martin's, which repulsed the enemy's attack under Jackson on the evening of the 2nd instance, have excited the highest admiration. These noble feats of arms recall the glorious days of Middletown, Boonesboro, Antietam, Martinsville, Upperville, Barbers, and Amosville, where the 1st Brigade shared with us the triumphs of victory, and they will now, while exulting in this success, join in sorrow for the brave who have fallen. The gallant McVicker, the generous Keenan, with 150 killed and wounded from your small numbers, attest to the terrible earnestness that animated the midnight conflict of the 2nd of May. A. Pleasanton, Brigadier General Commanding.